We'll be moving to the third lecture for this section, which is towards reimagining teaching and research as the phenomenology of care in South Africa. Our speaker is Dr. Oscar Koopman from Stellenbosch University, South Africa. So I will be sharing his screen from here. Dr. Koopman, please, you can talk to us. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Esther. And thank you for inviting me and also for those thought-provoking presentations just before my presentation. But from my side, colleagues, greetings from a very, very cold and wet Cape Town. Perhaps one of the coldest winters that I've ever experienced in a very, very long time. But let me quickly just engage, with you about my presentation. So I'm presenting today not just as a scholar or a researcher, but as someone that's deeply concerned about the state of education in Africa as well as in South Africa. And so my presentation will draw on the wisdom of two scholars whose work is deeply immersed in phenomenology. These scholars are Terayoki and Jan Patoka. And so I use the work of these scholars to address what I call the shadow burden of the African child. Esther, can you go to slide 2, please? I can't see my slides on the screen. Esther, can you hear me?
Yes. I'm
Can
going
you
to
go
the
to
next
slide 2?
slide here.
Okay, because there's nothing on my screen yet. This side, I can't see anything. Maybe it's just, okay.
Can you see
Is
something
this
now?
the slide? No, I can't see anything on the screen here.
Can anyone see my screen?
Yes, we can see it. We can see the slides.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. There we go. So these shadow burdens are not abstract concepts. They are the lived realities of learners who carry the weight of over 3.5 millennia of colonialism, followed by 5 decades of apartheid in South Africa. And so these historical traumas have created what I argue or call is a broken educational system that prioritizes outcomes over the understanding and needs of African learners. So the shadow extends to encompass contemporary challenges, systemic poverty, ongoing social inequalities, and the psychological impacts of rapid societal changes. And so this is why we need renewed focus on caring as a fundamental virtue for teachers and researchers. So if you look at the statistical realities, right, so we actually get a sobering sort of statistics that illustrates the depth of this crisis. So in South Africa, 55% of the population live below the poverty line. And so in education, we observe that 8 out of 10 pupils, and yeah, I'm talking about grade 4 pupils, cannot read proficiently. If you look at the trends in mathematics and scientific study, which is the TIMSS, reveals that 63% of grade 5 learners perform below the low international benchmarks in mathematics. So a figure that may rise to 76% due to COVID-19, right? So the most alarming of all these statistics is reading, where projections suggest that up to 88% of grade 5 learners may score below the low international benchmark. And these are not just statistics, they represent a generation of African learners struggling against the tide of historical injustice and contemporary neglect. And so thus, the shadow burden that these learners carry is not just one of material deprivation, but of thwarted potential and stunted dreams. So, but why do we have this crisis? And the answer lies in how we approach education, especially teaching and learning and research. Both teaching and research in South Africa has become what Barnacle calls treating the learner and the research subject as a mere brain in a vat. And so the Cartesian approach, with its mind-body dualism, has done tremendous damage. So it dismisses embodied knowledge, prioritizing mechanical aspects of the mind over the lived experiences of learners. And here I'm talking about African learners. And so Western epistemologies have gradually, as Jagodzinski puts it, exercised the blanket spaces that give color to our lives, minimizing essential constituents of experiential structure. Next slide, please. And so this brings me to Ted Aoki's profound contribution to our understanding of teaching. And so one of the greatest curriculum scholars in the world alive today, William Piner, in a book he dedicated to Ted Aoki called Curriculum in a New Key, The Collective Words of Aoki, Piner actually knows that Aoki leads us into the inner layer, a layer he characterizes as a journey on the way towards understanding teaching as a mode of being. And so Aoki challenges teachers to transcend traditional technocratic approaches and embrace a more holistic, empathetic stance. He urges teachers to break away from the attitude of grasping and grasping and grasping. So instead of genuine orientation to the essence of teaching, teachers focus on the grasping. And so for Aoki, teaching is a practice deeply attuned to the space where care resides, a place of gathering and belonging where the mutual presence of care from both teachers and students fosters some form of shared indwelling. And so in the African context, this vision is crucial for compelling teachers to acknowledge and turn towards eliminating the shadow burdens that still subject many African learners. And so Aoki's notion of care, which is rooted in the Japanese heritage of kate, focuses on the inherent qualities of teachers to act with compassion and moral responsibility, not contingent on learners' acknowledgement or reciprocation. Next slide, please. And so this leads us to what is called a trans-epistemological dialogue. And so central to Aoki's philosophy is what he calls dwelling humanly together, creating spaces of mutual respect that transcend historical wounds. But this goes beyond empathy. And so it draws on the work of the anthropologist Maruyama. And so Aoki explains that empathy is a projection of feelings between two persons within one epistemology. For understanding in a transcultural situation, what we need is transpection, which is a trans-epistemological process. And so this means bridging two ways of knowing through conversation and listening with care. And so Aoki then draws on Oakeshott's powerful insight when he writes, and I quote, "As civilized human beings, we are the inheritors of a conversation that began in the primeval forest." So education, properly speaking, is an initiation into the skill and partnership of this conversation. And so this generative conversational space then is where learners and teachers learn to listen, speak, and understand each other, co-creating intellectual and moral foundations for respectful coexistence despite historical divides. And here Aoki draws on what he calls an example of Miss O, who listens to and is attuned to the care that calls for the very living with the grade 5 pupils. And so he exemplifies this approach. Next slide, please. And so complementing Aoki's vision is Jan Patoka's concept of caring for the soul. Patoka, a sheikh, a phenomenologist and student of the soul, developed this philosophy under conditions of oppression, banned from teaching under the Nazi and communist regimes. And so for Patoka, the soul is not an object, but our fundamental capacity to understand the world. And he writes, I open quote, "When thinking begins, on the one side stands the world, like a collection of everything which is. On the other side stands the philosophizing man with his ability to understand. This ability to understand, this is called the soul. The soul serves as the bridge between individual consciousness and existence, allowing us to perceive the world and actively participate in uncovering its meaning. To care for the soul means moving human life with truth, engaging authentically with existence through reflective, lived experience. Next slide, please. Movement of the soul. Patoka poses the essential question: why should we care for the soul, particularly when it forces us to confront difficult questions about good and evil? And Findlay writes, the soul acts on us in those moments when we must decide, by recognizing truth and by differentiation between good and evil. Close quote. This is not a given characteristic, but an inherent possibility available only if we pursue it. It comes at a price. The decision to act based on recognition of good and evil means accepting the burden of a life that is no longer simple but problematic. For Patoka, caring for the soul allows us to grow in our capacity to understand life's ethical and existential questions. This movement towards growth is what he associates with the pursuit of good, while neglecting the soul leads to moral and existential deterioration. And so, in educational terms, this means helping learners, and here I'm talking about African learners and African students, develop what Patoka calls parisia, which is the courage to speak truth without fear or favor. The classroom becomes a space where learners are encouraged to live truthfully and develop as a whole engaged human beings as they pursue deeper levels of discovering the beauty of life. And so, what are the pedagogical principles if we draw and combine the work, the theories, or the philosophical ideas of Aoki and Patoka? And so, when we combine Aoki's caring and Patoka's soul care, we unlock a framework for addressing the shadow burdens of African children. This requires teachers to create learning environments that acknowledge and validate lived experience. Practically, this means incorporating local knowledge systems and languages into curricula, fostering critical dialogues about historical injustices, and encouraging students to explore their cultural identities. Teachers implement Aoki's dwelling humanly together by creating collaborative spaces where student voices are valued. Patoka's emphasis on soul care is realized through contemplative practices, journaling, and arts-based methods that allow students to explore their inner worlds and connect personal experiences to broader societal issues. Assessment practices must also be reimagined, moving beyond standardized measures to recognize personal growth and critical consciousness and the ability to navigate complex social spaces. And so this honors Aoki's human dimension as well as Patoka's authentic engagement with the world. Next slide, please. Finally, these principles transform educational research. The phenomenological framework requires looking deeply into the soul of research participants, treating their stories as experiences as sacred. Fieldwork becomes mutually enriching, discovery rather than one-sided data collection. Traditional hierarchical relationships are reimagined as collaborative partnerships. Researchers engage with what Van Manen calls hermeneutic conversations, where both parties contribute to constructing meaning. And this also aligns with Aoki's vision of mutual engagement and shared responsibilities. The process of analyzing data becomes an exercise in caring for the soul of the research participant. Researchers seek to understand participants' worlds while acknowledging their own positionality. Research findings preserve the richness and complexity of participants' stories through extensive quotes, narrative forms, or artistic representations. So the ultimate aim is not just generating knowledge, but contributing to understanding the lived world of African learners with historical burdens, helping improve educational practices and policies. It is in this shared space of care, reflection, and human dwelling that true transformation can occur, breaking free from oppressive systems of the past and moving towards a future where all learners can thrive. Thank you. That's my presentation, colleagues.
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. So